I will begin. Thank you again for coming out of bed so early in the morning to be to this panel. It's Selling Education. How does capitalism change the education system? Originally, we were going to have John Gotchard, but he does not appear to be here at the moment and lives in Salt Lake, so it's very dubious that he will be down if he's not here by now. However, we have a wonderful panelist who has shown up and prepared, has been preparing for quite some time for this, and is sure to be excellent. Doni Faber is a certified elementary teacher who is active in issues regarding education. She has taught third grade at a Title I school and now teaches students one-to-one in K through 12. She also put together the Save Our Schools march and rally, and is a staunch defender of education. I will be filling in for John Gotchard on the question of education and capitalism. And so I don't know why I introduced myself, but I'm Greg and the planner of this conference and a proud member of the Revolutionary Students Union, and I'm currently going to school to become a stagehand with IATSE Local 99. So with that, I will turn it over to Doni. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you all for coming out. So my concern is primarily with the K through 12 education. I'm a certified elementary school teacher. I taught for 1 year in a Title I school, which means that it serves a low socioeconomic populace. And my contract wasn't renewed because I didn't perform well enough. And so I decided, instead of going to another school, that I would tutor kids one-on-one. So I am a dropout of a dysfunctional system. But I'm still intensely invested in what is happening in that system because it's where the majority of teachers and students are. So the problem with public schools, as with any public institution in the United States, is that they're trying to serve two incompatible forces. One is they're trying to create a workforce within a functioning economy, and the other is they're trying to create informed citizenry. And these two goals are incompatible because the capitalism, the economic system, and democracy, our government system, are incompatible. And the reason this is because democracy is supposed to be serving the voices of the many, while capitalism is generating profit that accumulates in the hands of the few. So the voices of the few outweigh the voices of the many, because with that money comes more power. And we can see this trend building ever since World War II. For example, the 14th Amendment was created to give black people equal rights under the law. However, that amendment has been used the majority of the time to defend corporate rights, because corporations are considered persons under the law. But of course, corporations themselves have no agency. They're not actually people. And so it's the CEOs who are generating those actions. And the CEOs have become, fewer and fewer people are controlling more and more of the wealth and power. The top 1% in the United States owns nearly half the wealth of the country. Meanwhile, poverty rates are the highest that they've ever been since 1959, when they started keeping track of poverty rates with the census. Now, Warren Buffett, who is one of these super elite, said himself recently that we need to stop coddling the rich. There's no reason to do it. The rich are willing to pay taxes, and it doesn't make any sense when you're in a recession to not go to the source where there's money, and that they're willing to pay taxes. And so the government is creating policies that hurt the American people by and large, and are only benefiting a few individuals. So the way that this plays out in schools is two main ways. First, with economic control. They are taking over, there's been an expansion into the public domain. So we've seen this, the healthcare has been privatized, the military has been privatized, disaster relief has been privatized, and now the battleground has become schools. And we don't want the schools to be a for-profit model, because if the sole motive is profit, then it's not going to serve the interests of the people within that system, namely the teachers and the students. Rather, it's just going to benefit the few CEOs who have invested in that system. There's even a term for it now. It's called the education industry, and low estimates are that it is valued at between $630 to $680 billion a year. So there definitely is an incentive, an economic incentive, to take control of the public schools. Now, supposedly the idea is that a free market system will be beneficial for the education system, because then we'll just simply close the schools that are failing and put more funds into the schools that are succeeding. But the reason this doesn't work is because we want all of our students to succeed. We don't want them to be in competition with one another to the point of failure if they don't succeed. So if you close a school, theoretically, children should be able to just go to another school. But that causes overcrowding in that new school, which creates worse teaching conditions for the teachers in that school. Also, there is not a consistent attempt on the part of the government to fund transportation when they close schools. So if the parents don't have the resources to provide transportation to those new schools, I'm concerned that there is going to be an increase in dropout rates. Another concern is that if profit is the main motive, then the people running the schools are going to be cutting corners wherever they can. And this is going to see a reduction in programs like English learning language, special needs, and then programs that are broader, that are supposed to address all of the students' needs. We've seen a reduction in reading specialists. Hardly any schools can afford to pay a reading specialist right now, which is ridiculous because our rates compared globally are sinking in reading. So this is something that we really need to build up. And the main architect of this so-called reform movement is Milton Friedman. His concern was primarily with private schools. He felt that private schools were at a disadvantage because they didn't have access to public funds. And so this saw the birth of the voucher movement and the charter school movement, which are both trends towards privatization of the public school system. Personally, I think that agenda is misplaced. I'm not terribly concerned about how the private schools are doing. I'm concerned about how the public schools are doing. But there is one thing that Milton Friedman and I do agree on, which is he thinks that it is a good investment to train our workers, more important than investing in technology. And the reason this is applicable in education is because there is a shift away from supporting teachers as with education as a career. So we see this in, for example, in Ogden recently, the teachers were forced to sign a contract that they weren't able to negotiate the terms. And we're getting, the unions are getting eaten away by this kind of legislation. Well, I'm sorry, there's also legislation at the state level to try to take away power from the unions. And the problem with this, I guess the idea is that tenured teachers are too expensive. But that's absolutely not true, because tenured teachers are the kind of teachers we need. Now, I got an education program as an undergraduate. I got a master's in education. I took all the certified testing, so I was considered a highly qualified teacher. I was absolutely not a good teacher my first year of teaching. And when I talk to seasoned teachers, they say it takes 5 years to become a good teacher. So if we are punishing teachers and firing them for not making average yearly progress, which is a requirement for federal funding, then we are not creating the kinds of teachers that we need in order to have an effective education. The second way that capitalism and capitalists are interfering with the education system today is through structural control. So they're not just trying to make a profit, but they're also making structural changes that are bad for us. So we see this through inequitable funding to schools, school closure, disconnecting public funding from public oversight, demoralizing the workforce through tax on unions, and increasingly centralized control, which we see through increased standardized testing and curriculum. So what is the solution? Doesn't it make more sense to tax corporations, take that funding, and then create committees that are informed by educators, the people who are trained to know what students need? So instead of giving CEOs the power to dictate what goes on in schools, we use their money to fund our schools, and then we as a democracy decide what we want in our schools. We need policy informed by educators. We need to strengthen unions. We need to be able to elect school board representatives. We need to give teachers the power to design relevant curriculum and assessment for their students. Fund struggling schools and stop siphoning funds off from public schools to elite charter schools. And we need to teach students how to engage critically so that they can fight the injustices of the world. And we also need to fight the injustices of the world ourselves. We are seeing what's happening with capitalism, where the power is going to a few individuals to the disadvantage of everyone else, and this is not working. We need to start looking at viable alternatives. And the people who have the funds to control the media have scared the public so much into believing that it is dangerous to even consider alternatives to capitalism. And we need to stop being manipulated and find ways to return to a functioning democracy.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to focus more on higher education. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk about briefly the structure of capitalism and its relation to non-market society. Then I would like to talk about the higher education institutions as sites of critical thinking and resistance. And then I would like to talk about how capitalism affects those sites of resistance, especially the academy. So let us start for a moment talking about capitalism. There is an ongoing myth, two myths actually. One is that capitalism is the most efficient system, which I'll deal with in a second. The second myth is that capitalism functions independently. And we have no reason to believe that capitalism functions independently, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. So first, let's deal with the myth of efficiency. It very well may be that competition is more effective on certain scales, but not others. So for example, you can make an argument, I don't think a particularly convincing one, but you can make an argument that we are all better off if corporations compete with each other. But what is a difficult argument to make is that every single factory worker on the line, the factory would be better off if they were competing with each other. You only have to think of an office where people don't like each other, they don't help each other, they don't work together, and to see that probably at that scale it wouldn't be particularly efficient, because the vast majority of human endeavors depend very deeply on human cooperation, not human competition. Now, to avoid running into the fallacy of composition, one may argue, well, okay, maybe there needs to be competition among every or cooperation internal to any firm, internal to any corporation, internal to every factory, internal to every institution. But on a macro level, it's better that we have competition. Well, perhaps, but then that brings us to the question of, can capitalism do this? Can capitalism, which is a system of profit-driven market exchange, can it stand on its own? The simple historical answer is no. Capitalism is not an independent system, and it continually relies upon the state and civil societies, non-capitalist civil society institutions. The most glaring example of these is colonialism and imperialism. For Europe to emerge as capitalist nations, they did not emerge out of free trade. They did not emerge out of rugged individuals deciding that they were going to exchange and accumulate wealth, and by free trade and free agreement and respecting each other's rights, that we will somehow emerge as a better society. Capitalism emerges through fire and sword. It emerged through the colonization of the Americas, the colonization of Africa, and the colonization of Asia. And certainly we could rehash all of those crimes, but my point is that initial influx of wealth depended intrinsically and absolutely on non-market interactions between European colonialists and, through colonization, and the emerging market economy. We can see that this progresses into the state. It was not rugged Robinson Crusoes who boldly, independently, as rugged Ayn Rand individuals pushed their way westward that came in to magically create the modern system of finance and capital and industry we see today. Instead, every step of the way they depended on non-state institutions, non-capitalist institutions, including the state, to fund infrastructure projects such as the Erie Canal, the turnpike systems, later the railroads, to finance a navy to provide something resembling calm on the open seas for international trade. They depended on non-state institutions, churches, philanthropists, libraries, etc., in order to provide education, to provide charity, to keep the American experiment going. The same, of course, in Europe, the Salvation Army, all sorts of religious and charitable institutions to keep the workers from being absolutely degraded. But then also you have poorhouses, prison houses, in which the poor or the criminal were forced into non-market economies of essential slavery, of forced production. Even today, we depend heavily on prison labor for all sorts of different aspects. All of these are non-market interactions. So, of course, this leads us to this topic at hand, education. In order to maintain an educated populace, we need an education system, fairly self-evident. We have tried the individual or religious or private institutions. We tried them for the first 100 years of our country. Now, certainly, there were many very effective private schools. The Jesuits come to mind. But they were an uneven development of education. The increase or the standardization of public education, on one hand, is a benefit for the workers and for the people of America because it provides them access to education, to books, to learning that they otherwise may not have received. But also is a benefit for the capitalist class. The reasons should be evident, because just as Doni said, it provides an educated workforce. So this creation of an education system, and also a public education system and a higher education system, really didn't take off until it received state support. Until there were community colleges, until there were state universities that by and large left them open to students of all socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, certainly not perfectly. We only have to look at Alabama and the struggle over integration in the universities there to see that the system has always been flawed. It has always been classed, racist, sexist, etc. white supremacist. But nevertheless, this institution, this non-market, non-profit-driven institution, became a cornerstone for the capitalist economy. Just as capitalism exploited the so-called untouched lands of America, just as capitalism exploits the so-called free education, we're facing a situation where the capitalists exploit the non-political or non-capitalist military and police. We're facing that same sort of reaction within the space of education. Education as an independent institution is necessary for capitalism to continue to survive. Capitalism as a parasitic system depends on these non-market institutions in order to maintain itself. When it does not allow for these non-market institutions, it's a catastrophe. And we can see this all across the board of privatization. We have the privatization, not that America ever at any point had socialized medicine or socialized insurance. We have privatized medicine. We have worse returns across the board than any other industrialized nation. We are moving towards a privatized military, which is not only more costly than the military has ever been in the history of this country, it is unable to meet basic geopolitical objectives. Not that, again, that I agree with them, but one merely needs to look at the military in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. And by and large, it met its military objectives under more difficult circumstances for a lower cost. And then we also only need to look at the privatization of the police forces. More and more rule of law that is so vital for capitalist existence. It is so vital for the protection of private property and the protection of individuals qua individuals to sell their labor and to be workers is disintegrating. So despite the need for this, there is, as Doni said, an ongoing need for profit. And this causes capitalism to seek new markets. And one of the new markets being sought is the education market, or as Doni so aptly put it, the education industry. We are facing privatization of our institutions of higher learning. Even tuition itself is a form of privatization. It makes the university less an institution of higher learning and puts it under the dynamic of a business. For example, in 1963, in New York, if you could pass the Board of Regents exam, which was a basic competency exam in New York, covering math, reading, science, etc., your school was free. Your school was paid for. By introducing tuition, you have made a step to alter an institution of higher learning, an academy, into a business. Whether it's a state or private-run business, it's still a business. You'll notice almost every single European nation, every single industrialized nation, not only does not charge tuition, but in fact gives a stipend to students who are going to school. While certainly we talk about the stress that Asian students, especially Japanese students in Japan, have over testing and getting into a good university, there it actually matters because their education is by and large free and they receive a stipend to go to school for it. In fact, of all the European nations, industrialized, heavily industrialized European nations, only the UK requires tuition. And they only began requiring tuition in this last year, at which point they had massive student rioting. So this drive to privatization is disrupting the entire function of upper education, which is not simply to train better workers, but also, and this brings us to my final point, to give a place for critical thinking and critical learning. Nowhere else are you going to find a location in the United States in which critical thinking is pushed as a positive good. A liberal education, for whatever flaws it may have, pushes automotive students, pushes piloting students, pushes plumbers, pushes carpenters to read, to learn mathematics beyond their narrow field, to learn philosophy, to learn ethics, to learn critical thinking. That is vital, absolutely vital for an informed populace, and absolutely vital for a critical thinking population that can offer substantive resistance to the ongoing corporatization, privatization, and domination, both in the education system, in our economy, and in our political system. The attacks on the university are not simply attacks on the goods of certification, of receiving a degree so that you can get a better job. It is nothing less than the attempt to reduce the American population to uncritical consumers that simply follow whatever winds the political and corporate elites may blow. And we can already begin to see this degradation all across our culture. A simple and obvious and widespread indication of this is the massive proliferation in the last 10 to 20 years of conspiracy theories. They are prevalent all across our society, and what it is a manifestation of workers unable to engage in the most basic critical thinking, to recognize the most basic fallacies, to understand the most basic political, scientific, geographical facts. And yet there is a drive for resistance. There is a drive to point out that something is wrong in our society. And without the academy, without the ability to critically think, to critically analyze the deluge of information we are presented with, both through the news media, the corporate media, and the internet, workers and Americans are left with nothing but a narrow, ill-defined notion of common sense, their own existent prejudices, and the reasoning and logic skills that we find in our corporate media and among our corporate pundits. And if that doesn't scare you, then I don't know what will. Thank you. Are there any questions, comments, objections, or crosstalk?
I'm sorry, I came late and I didn't catch
My name's Doni.
Doni?
Doni, D-O-N-I.
I wanted to ask you about the point you brought up about how it takes at least 5 years to get a good teacher and the value of tenure, because there is a lot of attack on tenure lately, and I'm curious what the solution may be, if you can speak to a stagnation or educators who get too comfortable and that kind of thing and actually become part of the problem.
Well, the response that I've heard people from AFT say, which is one of the main teacher unions, is that unions do not prevent principals from firing teachers who are incompetent at their jobs. Mm-hmm. So the concern that unions prevent getting rid of teachers that are bad is kind of not a legitimate argument. Unions are for protecting people's rights against things like racial discrimination, sexual orientation, religious discrimination, stuff like that. So, the solution for me is to help people realize that we do need experienced teachers in the field, so that we can continue to have the sorts of policies where, as teachers teach longer. They do get increments in their pay scale, but not a lot. I mean, teachers aren't paid a whole heck of a lot comparatively. So it's going to be less expensive in the long run to provide some small incentives for teachers to stay in the career that they are in, than to have a wide turnover where teachers are only teaching a few years and then getting burned out.
What are the incentives for continuing an education for teachers?
I think most people who are in education do it because they're passionate about it, because they care about their students and they care about their subject. And
more of a qualifiable attribute than incentive-based, monetary-based.
Yes. But we also don't want our teachers to be starving.
Right.
So we don't want to decrease the monetary incentive that does exist.
If I also can respond to that, tenure functions a little differently in upper education. And there's been an equal or perhaps even stronger attack on upper education tenure, which I actually failed to address, which is core to the mission of academia as critical thinking. As Doni said, tenure does not protect teachers. It just doesn't. Or it doesn't protect them from being fired. All it does is require that in order to fire them, you go through due process. Even then, it does not protect radical teachers. It does not protect teachers who advocate, or even college professors. The liberal university structure that is filled with commie pinkos, etc., does not protect radical professors. It only allows professors to be radical in very narrow, defined ways. You can teach courses on Marx, you can complain about capitalism, but you are not to attack America, you are not to say anything bad about America. If you do criticize America, you should only do so in a liberal framework, which is, isn't it so sad and tragic that we do such bad things? I hope we find the real America again, where we don't do bad things. So this sounds pretty abstract, but a good indication of this. I am personally not a fan of him at all, or his writings, or his positions. But Ward Churchill. Ward Churchill had unpleasant positions, unpopular positions, and they found a loophole and a technicality in order to sack him as a tenured professor. So this attack on tenure is not primarily an attack on lazy teachers. It is not primarily an attack on teachers who are too comfortable. It is not an attack on teachers who, are getting paid too much, as if there was really anything like that. It's an attack on free speech. It's an attack on critical ideas. It is an attack on those few voices, and I mean few, even in academia, those few voices in academia who would raise radical critiques of the education system, of the American world imperialist system, and the capitalist system. So tenure and the fight for tenure is, again, certainly, as Doni said, a fight to protect jobs, certainly a fight to get due process, but also it is a core fight to maintain the integrity of higher education as such. For without tenure, every professor is reduced to simply repeating whatever is necessary to maintain their jobs, to please the administrator, and to please whatever general public is at large that can put pressure on them. Any other questions, comments?
I wondered if Doni or Greg too would comment on the push for standardized tests and just why is that happening? Why do you think that's happening? Maybe English outlook behind as well.
I think it's happening because government officials think that there needs to be accountability in what is happening in the schools, which is true, there does. But the people who are creating the policies Our current Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, was a CEO of the schools in Chicago, so he has no training as a teacher. He comes from a business background. So they're creating these solutions that look easy, but they don't actually achieve what they're trying to. And they actually cost a lot of money and create a lot of pressure in the system instead of generating real improvement and real change. In contrast, Finland is one of the best education systems in the world, and they have practically no standardized testing at all. Yeah, I would say standardized testing is an attempt to do something about it, about improving the education system, but it's a poor attempt.
Do you think it comes out of ignorance? Do you think people who aren't actually in the education system are calling the shots?
Yeah, I think if policy were better informed by educators, that we'd be seeing more policies where educators were creating their own assessments, so that there was a better fit between what is being taught in the curriculum and what is being tested on.
I, of course, have a much more cynical view than Doni about this. There are, I believe, 3 main testing companies. Kaplan, and then there's 2 others. I always forget. PTS. Yeah. And what you'll notice is everywhere from beginning placement tests for like kindergarten up to the GRE and the GMAT, there are basically 3 testing companies. And these are tied, of course, to the textbook companies. Kaplan and McGraw-Hill, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is no ignorance, I think, on their part. I mean, it's always difficult to tell whether they're stupid or malicious, or a combination of the two. And that's a perennial question we face living in American society. But I think in this case, they're malicious, not simply stupid. And the rise of standardized testing is an attempt to privatize, a further attempt to privatize. Because through various means, state educators are not usually allowed to create their own tests. They're often allowed to give input, but most of the test creation is done contractually through private testing firms. State institutions are not allowed to create their own textbooks. While certainly they can give weight to what sort of criteria they want, they are not allowed as public institutions to create their own textbooks. So private institutions create the textbooks and make obscene profits off of them. I mean, every step of the way, there's only a surface facade of a public institution where behind there is corporate capitalism more and more eating away at the core, attempting to extort more and more money. No Child Left Behind demands that schools and the federal government pay, essentially, contractually, for private testing. It's money. It's money, plain and simple. So that's the pragmatic reason that this is going. But then also, again, we cannot underestimate the attack on critical thinking. The reduction of education to simple quantification is nothing less than the reduction of human beings to abstract numbers, which is not seen as a problem. It's seen as a benefit because in a market dynamic, quality has no meaning, only quantity. How long will this product last? That is not a question of quality. That is a question of how long until we can turn this product around and make another profit by selling it again. How long can they destroy the education system such that the average American student will need one-on-one tutoring, will need after-school classes, will need specialized books on mathematics, on reading, will require the parents to not only buy the books, but spend time out of their own, besides working as educators for their children. And I'm not against parents being involved in their education, but to fundamentally shift the burden from the education system as a public institution that, yes, is a teacher-parent partnership, into the parents themselves having to educate their students because the education system is so gutted that it no longer can or is willing to educate them, is a fundamental shift. And of course, who will receive these extra benefits that will soon, very quickly, become a necessity for even getting a basic education in the United States? The rich, the elite, those who don't work enough that they have the free time to serve as a second teacher. So it is not only a pragmatic attempt to make profit and corporatize and privatize further the education system. It is an all-out assault on the American public, their critical thinking skills, and their ability to be citizens in this republic, such as it is a republic, rather than being subjects to the plutocratic, the rich elite.
I just like to tap onto that. I think it's really important when you talk about how it's all about quantity, it's all about numbers. I think that economics is a really tricky thing and has evolved to the point where the qualitative approach to education and human capital actually weighs heavily on consumer sciences. I think that's really important for people to remember. The market now wants to study qualitative data in order to get parents to invest in their children, get people to invest in their ability to be laborers and produce revenue. And so I think just by simplifying and saying it's only about quantity leaves out a huge portion of how neoliberal theory has evolved and now encompasses qualitative approaches to investment in human capital.
Well, and I understand that, and I would agree with that. I mean, this is the whole, essentially the whole basis of the work of Michel Foucault, is that now we don't deal with individuals, we deal with population groups.
Actually, Michel Foucault focused very heavily on individual behavior when it came to neoliberal theory.
Well, I mean, if you look at History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Chapter 5, he talks about how state institutions, certainly there's individual conditioning, right? For example, every individual student, he makes a big point of penmanship. Penmanship was at one point simply an ability or a way to teach students how to read or how to write legibly. And as long as they wrote legibly, then it didn't matter. But there was an improvement in the education system in which every single step of penmanship was given a particular step. And if you look at our penmanship today, right, you'll see the number 1, and it tells you to do half loop, and then a number 2 to do another half loop, and then a number 3 to do the Q at the bottom. And so every individual student is now targeted. Every individual subject is subject to discipline, right? There's a particular way to do it, there's a particular way in which you have to act. But as a whole, policies are geared towards population groups. So you target the individual, and this is what No Child Left Behind does. It targets the individual, right? Every individual student is all individually tested, and they need to meet individual benchmarks. But the goal is to move population groups in certain directions. And there is a quality that they ascribe to this. A good indication of this is the new dynamics of quality of life, which are heavily linked to education. They focus on things such as earning power. They focus on things such as, and this is the quality aspect, or what they claim is a quality aspect. They focus on life satisfaction. Are you satisfied with your life? And there's a whole new exploding field in statistics and economics about happiness and the qualifications of happiness. And do people feel that they're happy? Do they feel satisfied with their relationship and with their job? And do they feel as though there is progress? And do they feel that they are fulfilled in their work? But there are fundamental questions that cannot be answered within these dynamics. Certainly they care about the quality of life insofar as the workers are happy with themselves or can be convinced that they're happy with themselves and their lot and their situation. But in this case, whole swaths of human science, whole swaths of human endeavors and art no longer matter. It may matter that you know and pass your AP Psych class and that our school is doing well because more than 50% of the people pass their AP Psych class and more than 70% are college bound. And we know that college is going to provide a better standard of living both through earnings and through life satisfaction. But there's no question, is Freud right in Civilization and its Discontents? That our modern existence is inherently alienating, that we are becoming grossly separated from from the individuals around us. Those are questions that will never be taken into account by the emerging neoliberal orthodoxy because they're not quantifiable. They're questions of ethics. They're questions of philosophy. Is Marx correct that capitalism is an exploitative and rapacious system? There's no standardized tests in which we can find out if this is valuable to students, other than, did you enjoy the course in which Marx was talked about? Did you enjoy the course in which Freud was talked about? How would you rate your teacher on a scale of 1 to 5 as informative, as friendly, as, et cetera, et cetera? But there by its very nature can be no quantitative question. Has the examination of Marx, of Freud, of Simone de Beauvoir, of bell hooks, of Irigaray altered your life, radically shifted your thinking, or completely changed your view of society? I hope that clarifies my position on that.
No, your position is very clear. what I want to emphasize and what I meant was how economic theorists and capitalists use qualifiable data, and I don't just mean life satisfaction, but the qualifiable data of the time mothers invest in their children, of the investments parents make into their kids' education, and how these things are turned into positives in order to not just have a better quality of life, but to extend their lives, invest in qualifiable investments in health and things like that. So ultimately, they can participate in the capitalist system longer. And so it's not that, and so it's, my whole point was just to bring it up to say it's not just about quantity, but it's really interesting to see how tricky it is, how they have used qualifiable data in order to produce better consumers.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I've talked really long. Would you like to?
Well, I would just say that, and this is perhaps in disagreement with what you just said, but I think that the qualitative aspects are crucial to understanding how a system ought to function, and that in a system where the sole motive is profit, that the focus is on quantifiable data, and so those things are being overlooked. And it doesn't matter if it's functioning, if it's working for the people within it, as long as it's making a profit.
Right.
So I think we definitely need to look at more qualifiable data.
Right, how they work in tandem in order to create better consumers and investments in capitalism.
Yeah, and I just recently heard a report on NPR, and this is sort of the example that I think sort of speaks to what you're talking about. They characterize the vocabulary of children and the vocabulary of children used to their parents, right? So ostensibly nothing capitalist about this. But what they noticed is upper class children would use like 11,000 words in interaction with their parents. Middle class would use like 1,000 words. And then, and I'm sorry, it wasn't that recently, but they use the words, they characterize the different number of words used by the parent and the different number of words used by the child. And they actually found that lower class parents use less words to their children and use less vocabulary with their children than upper class children use with their parents. So ostensibly, there's nothing capitalist about this, right? It's just about number of words. But what happens is there's a whole host of questions about race, about class, that don't get addressed, and it becomes a matter of selling lower class parents vocabulary books to use with their children in order to help bridge that class gap, right? It becomes about pushing an educational theory about using more words to enrich their lives. And of course, right, no one's against enriching children's lives, and this certainly would enrich their lives, and we should not in any way, shape, or form denigrate children using more words than less. But this is the point of, and there's a whole host of, in a certain sense, qualitative sciences, but they're reduced to quantitative factors like number of words. But there's no qualitative question of, is it a just society that this exists? That there is this class division? And I think this speaks very much to what Doni was initially saying. Even at its absolute best, when capitalism is examining human sciences, it is looking to create a better consumer, a healthcare consumer, an education consumer, even a political consumer. This is antithetical to any form of democracy in which we look for subjects, those who act, who make choices. And this is where capitalist education and the attack on the academy go hand in hand. They want to reduce us all from acting subjects to simple consumers. And only in academia, or primarily in academia as an institution, is the primary institution of critical thought and critical thinking that allows us to be political subjects and instead of being political consumers.
Doni, you mentioned tension between democracy and capitalism, and you talked about a lot about funding and control of schools. Do you see that tension play out in curriculum?
Right now, it's not as strong in curriculum because states are in control of their own curriculum. There's a Common Core initiative, which is actually state-led. So I don't see that as problematic either. I think it's good that the states are trying to get on the same page as each other, and the teachers are giving input to what that Common Core should consist of. So I see it more of a problem in mechanisms like assessment than the curriculum itself.
If I may as well. And it all varies from area to area. Like here in Utah, there's not a huge curriculum problem. But if you travel to Texas, for example, curriculum is a huge issue. Not just, there's all across the Midwest, there is a curriculum battle over evolution. But in Texas, you have the whitewashing of things like slavery, Jim Crow. So capitalism functions best when it deals with quantities. If it can quantify something and generate profit from it, then that's how it functions best. But if it can't do that, or it can't completely crush any resistance through its market mechanisms, it will engage in qualitative efforts, such as white supremacy. So in places where there are large minority groups, and sometimes they're not even the minority, places in the South, blacks are the majority, there is a real struggle over education, both quantitatively in denying funding to black schools, but also qualitatively, which is denying race, denying slavery, denying the entire history of America in order to prop up white supremacy. It's worth noting, in Arizona, you have SB 1070, and one of the very first actions they took was to destroy ethnic studies, to defund all of them. And that is, again, this was the upper educations of higher learning. But again, it's a white supremacist tool that capitalism uses in order to degrade students and to reduce them to mere political consumers. And so culture is not something vibrant. It's not something that is a point of resistance against capitalism, against imperialism. culture is a kind of food that you buy, or a kind of market you go to pick up food, to pick up, or a kind of clothes that you wear.
I wanted to say one more thing, which is that I think curriculum is not highly problematic as long as it's given in general enough terms that it gives teachers leeway room for teaching things within it that are important to them. The problem comes more from things like basal programs, where teachers are expected to have fidelity to the program, and these start to look like scripted teaching, where teachers are no longer trusted as the professionals they are, and they're supposed to just, the districts spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more than that, on these programs, and so I think that's more where the problem is not in the state created curriculums, but in the programs that the teachers are expected to follow.
Just a follow-up there, don't you think that the curriculums where teachers are expected to follow a specific course outline, are those normally geared towards some sort of standardized testing, which is again aiming at some sort of quantifiable result?
So there's so many different standardized tests, it's kind of hard to answer that. Here in Utah, we have the CRTs, the Criterion Reference Tests, which are linked up with the No Child Left Behind funding. And those are supposed to be aligned with the core curriculum. Now, of course, it's very difficult to actually have a good alignment with what you're teaching when you're not allowed to see the tests beforehand. You're not really supposed to be looking at them while you have them in possession. So it makes a lot more sense to me to figure out what you want the student to learn, give them a pre-assessment to figure out what they do know, teach them, and then give them assessment on the very things that you want to see if they learn. When you take the control away from the teachers into these private corporations that are creating the standardized tests, then of course there's going to be a disconnect between the curriculum and the assessment, regardless of how aligned they're supposed to be, because they're not the ones in the classroom.
All right, are there any other questions, comments? Then
Michael, let's give them a hand.
And if you'd like to stick around, and you should, Dr. Michael Parenti is next, and he will be